Next time you get a headache, you take a pill. Maybe you lie down for an hour. Worst case, you go to a doctor with bright lights, sterile tools, and anesthesia. But 10,000 years ago, if something was wrong inside your skull, your ancestors had a solution. They would cut a hole directly into your head while you were awake with a sharpened rock. And here's the part that should be impossible. Most of them lived. To understand how this is possible, you have to go back to 1867, to a cemetery on the southern coast of Peru. A team excavating ancient burial sites pulled a skull out of the ground that stopped them cold. Cut into the top of it was a square hole, roughly 2 inches across. At first, the assumption was simple. This person had been attacked. A weapon, a blow, something violent. But when they looked closer at the edges of the hole, nothing matched that story. The bone around the opening wasn't sharp or splintered. It was smooth, rounded, layered with new bone growth. This wasn't a wound. This was a wound that had healed. Here is what nobody tells you about that discovery. A skull doesn't heal around a hole unless the person survived long enough for the body to repair itself. Bone regrowth like this takes months, sometimes years. Which meant the person with the square hole in their head didn't die on an operating table 10,000 years ago. They walked around afterward. They lived their life with a permanent opening in their skull that their own body had partially closed over. At first, archaeologists assumed this had to be an isolated case, a strange one-off. Then they started finding more. Not dozens, thousands. Skulls with deliberate holes, found across Peru, across Europe, across Africa, across Asia. Different cultures. Different time periods. Separated by oceans and thousands of years, with no possible contact between them. And in every single location, the holes followed the same basic pattern. Carefully shaped. Strategically placed. And in a significant number of cases, healed. This procedure has a name. Trepanation. The deliberate removal of a section of skull bone while the patient is alive. And once researchers started cataloging trepanned skulls systematically, the numbers became almost impossible to believe. Let that sink in. In some excavation sites in Peru, researchers examined skulls spanning roughly 2,000 years of trepanation practice. In the earliest examples, survival rates were low. Many patients didn't make it. But by the later periods, something had changed. Survival rates in some of these later sites climbed above 80%. 80%. With stone tools. With no anesthesia. With no understanding of bacteria, infection, or how the human brain actually functions. Compare that to European battlefield surgeons performing similar skull operations in the 1800s, with metal instruments, with formal medical training, with centuries of accumulated anatomical knowledge. Their survival rates for comparable procedures were often below 50%. Ancient surgeons in Peru, working with sharpened obsidian and bone scrapers, were outperforming trained European doctors by a margin that should not exist. How? The answer isn't luck. It's technique. And the technique itself is where this gets genuinely uncomfortable, because to understand how they achieved these numbers, you have to understand exactly what the procedure involved. There were several methods, refined over generations, and each one tells you something different about the people who developed it. The first method was scraping. Slowly, repeatedly grinding away at the surface of the skull with a sharp stone tool until a section of bone was thin enough to remove. This method was slow. It could take hours. The surgeon would work in small, careful passes, stopping constantly to check progress. But it was also the safest, because it gave the surgeon constant control and reduced the risk of cutting too deep, too fast. Scraping was the method of someone who valued certainty over speed. Someone willing to spend an entire afternoon, inch by inch, rather than risk a single wrong movement. The second method was different. A rectangular pattern of grooves cut into the skull, deep enough to weaken the bone along precise lines, then the resulting section lifted out like a trapdoor. This was faster than scraping, But it was also riskier, because each groove had to be cut to almost exactly the same depth, and any single cut that went too deep could be fatal before the procedure was even finished. This method required confidence. It required a surgeon who had done this enough times to trust their own hands under pressure. The third method used a circular drilling motion, rotating a sharp tool back and forth to bore through the bone in a ring shape until the center section could be lifted free. This method left a distinctive circular scar in the bone, and it's the one most often associated with trepanation in popular imagination. It required steady, repetitive motion sustained over a long period, and it produced the cleanest, most controlled opening of the three methods when done correctly. 3 completely different approaches. 3 completely different risk profiles. And the fact that all three existed, refined independently in different regions, tells you something important. This wasn't one lucky discovery that spread. It was a problem that multiple cultures solved, multiple times, using whatever tools and traditions they already had. Here's what made the difference between survival and death, regardless of which method was used. Depth control. The skull is not one solid piece. It has multiple layers. Outer bone, a spongy middle layer, inner bone, and beneath that, a thin membrane protecting the brain itself. Cut too shallow, and the procedure does nothing. Cut too deep, and you puncture that membrane, and the patient dies, almost always from infection within days. The ancient surgeons who achieved 80% survival rates had learned, through generations of trial and accumulated knowledge, exactly how deep was too deep. Not through textbooks. Not through diagrams. Through repetition, observation, and an oral tradition of surgical knowledge passed from one practitioner to the next. And they were doing this while the patient was conscious. There is evidence that some cultures used coca leaves, alcohol, or other plant-based substances to dull pain and induce a calmer state. But full anesthesia, the kind that puts a patient completely under, did not exist. The patient was awake. Possibly sedated to some degree, but awake, while a stone tool ground slowly through the bone protecting their brain. Now here's the question that should be bothering you. Why would anyone agree to this? Why would a community develop and refine a procedure this extreme, generation after generation, unless it was actually solving a real problem? The most likely answer connects to something else found at these sites. Many of the skulls showing trepanation also show evidence of serious head trauma. Skull fractures. Depression injuries, the kind caused by a heavy blow. In a world without modern medicine, a severe head injury that caused swelling inside the skull would have been a death sentence. Pressure building inside a sealed bone container, with nowhere to go, crushing the brain from the inside. Trepanation, in many of these cases, may have been the only possible intervention. Relieving that pressure by removing a section of bone. Giving the swollen brain somewhere to expand without being crushed. It wasn't a ritual performed on healthy people for spiritual reasons, although some evidence suggests that happened too. In a significant number of cases, it was emergency neurosurgery. A direct, physical solution to a problem that, left untreated, was fatal. But the part of this story that's almost never told is what happened next. Because trepanation wasn't a one-time fix in a single culture. The evidence shows the same basic procedure appearing again and again, in places with no possible contact with each other. Trepanned skulls have been found in ancient France, dating back over 6,000 years. In ancient China. In ancient sites across North Africa. In the Pacific Islands. Separate cultures, separate continents, separate timelines, all arriving at the same fundamental solution. Cut a hole in the skull to relieve pressure on the brain. Not because they copied each other. Because the problem itself, severe head trauma with no other treatment available, had one answer that worked. And once any culture discovered that opening the skull could save a life instead of ending one, the knowledge became too valuable to lose. It got passed down. Refined. Improved. Generation after generation, until the survival rate in some places climbed high enough that the surgery stopped being a desperate last resort and became something closer to an established medical practice. And it worked. Often enough, repeated enough, refined enough, that by certain periods in certain regions, it worked more often than not. Go back to your headache. The pill you take, the rest you get, the hospital you'd go to if things got serious, all of it exists because somewhere in the chain of human history, someone looked at a person dying from pressure inside their skull and thought, I can fix this. And then did. With a rock. While the patient was awake. And it worked often enough that the knowledge survived. Got passed down. Got refined. Generation after generation, across continents that never knew about each other, until eventually, thousands of years later, it became the sterile, anesthetized, technologically advanced version you'd recognize as a hospital today. You didn't inherit modern medicine from nowhere. You inherited it from people who looked at an impossible problem, with nothing but stone and accumulated knowledge, and refused to let it stay impossible. Like this video if it changed the way you think about something you'd never expected to think about today.